map basically of the spread of Islam from 632 to 750. It started in Arabia and spread outward into several cultural zones. The Arabic, Persian, Black, African, Turkic, Indian, Malay, and Chinese. And they each kind of have their own kind of styles of religion or interpretations of the Quran, different views of Muhammad, stuff like that. But they share a universal Islamic character. One really important term to the Arabic term is Ummah, and it basically refers to the totality of the people who are Muslim and constitute the Islamic world. Muslims refer to others by their religious identity only, not like their origins or race or anything like that. All Muslims are bound by the Quranic message of divine oneness, messengership of the Prophet, and acceptance of divine law, which was basically a legal system. It was said to be handed down from Allah himself by like word of mouth. There's a powerful bond of brotherhood and sisterhood. They consider themselves a single religious community, although they're not necessarily politically united. And this is a verse from the Quran which basically sums this up. It says, "And hold fast, all of you together, to the cable of God, and do not separate." Okay, so Islam is basically, their religion is their total way of life. Like everything they do is basically based on their religion. They don't accept the validity of a domain outside the realm of religion and sacred. The words secular and profane cannot actually be translated directly into their traditional languages. Their message is basically if you accept God as the one and submit to Him, it will result in peace. Their religion is not based on a historical event necessarily or an ethnic collectivity. It's based on a universal truth, which has always been and always will be, that God is the one, we owe everything to Him. The Quran refers to Abraham, and even though he lived long before the historical manifestation of Islam, they refer to him as Muslim and say he belonged to that, original monotheism that survived among a few. Because there was the age of ignorance, which is a lot of men and women in the Arab society fell into idolatry and polytheism before the rise of Islam. They believe in the afterlife, much like Christianity. They're judged, go to heaven or hell. They believe the Quran is the verbatim word of God. There's no variant text. So to become Muslim, you just have to bear testimony between two other Muslims that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Okay, so the private aspects of life that are influenced by religion, treatment of the body is a big thing. There are hygienic dietary regulations. They are forbidden to drink alcohol, eat pork and all of its derivatives, or consume certain other types of meat, such as those of carnivorous animals. And meat from animals which is able to be consumed has to be sacrificed in the name of God. Like on page 571, it references the great feast of the Immolation, which is also called the Feast of Sacrifice. It's a 3-day celebration at the end of the Hajj, which is their pilgrimage to Mecca. They sacrifice the animal and distribute meat to relatives, neighbors, and the poor. There's prohibition of self-harm. Piety, the children are expected to be kind and respect parents. There are strong family bonds. And the modern attitude of basically, my body is my own, my life is my own, I can do whatever I want, is completely foreign to them. Because they're basically, nothing is our own, it all belongs to God. Any rights we have, we only get from the fulfillment of responsibilities to God. So the public aspects, some of their rules or teachings are general moral instructions, others are formulated in concrete law. Their religion is concerned with the public domain as well, with social, economic, and political lives. Human relations that are considered by Islam include social transactions and interactions. They're supposed to help orphans and destitute. They're supposed to embrace stranger Muslims, non-Muslims, basically everyone. There are rules relating to transactions. There's religious taxation. You're expected to be charitable. Prohibition of usury. Okay, and what we think of as economics today, they basically relate everything to ethics. So their economic is basically in place to check and limit human greed, selfishness, in order to prevent them from destroying the exercise of justice. Another public aspect is war, which has been taken out of context a lot modernly, because some Muslim extremists translate jihad into like holy war, but the traditional meaning is exertion, which means physical or mental effort in the path of God. They're defensive. They only use aggression at all as like a means of last resort, like defense. There's outward jihad, which is preserving their religion or homeland from attack, and then inward, which is battling negative tendencies within the soul, like temptations, and then being faithful. So their practices are the 5 pillars of Islam, which probably most of you are somewhat familiar with. Shahada is faith, which is basically the declaration of faith when you first become Muslim, which is God is the one, Muhammad is the prophet. They believe that the only purpose of life is to serve and obey God. This is achieved through the teachings of Muhammad. Salah is the prayers. They have 5 daily prayers. They're done at dawn, midday, late afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. The prayers contain verses from the Quran. They're said in Arabic. It's preferable to worship together in a mosque, but they can be said anywhere. Zakah is almsgiving. It directly means purification and growth, because if they like set aside some of their possessions, then the ones they do have are purified, and this allows for spiritual growth. They're expected to annually set aside a 40th of their capital, which excludes items like primary residence, car, or professional tools. Psalm is fasting. This is done annually during Ramadan. They fast from dawn until sundown. They can't drink, eat, or have sexual relations. It's a method of self-purification and self-restraint so they can focus on their purpose of life and be aware of the presence of God. Another verse right here, it says, O you who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed to those before you, that you may learn self-restraint. So the Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca. They go around the Kaaba, which is like a cubic, like little house. It's like, they consider it the house of God, and it's within the Grand Mosque in Mecca. They go around it 7 times. After that, they go 7 times between the hills of Safa and Marwa, as Abraham's wife did during her search for water. Then they stand together at Arafat, which is like desert plains outside the city. They join in prayer for God's forgiveness, and a lot of them see this as like a preview for Judgment Day. Then the whole thing is closed with a festival of prayers and gift exchange. And we have a video of that. I guess I can turn the lights on if you want. Should we get the lights, please? Thank you. Okay, so the last thing about Islam is the men and the women's roles. The Quran refers to them as distinct sexes, unlike the Bible that just says man, basically, for all humankind. Both have immortal souls. They're held responsible for their actions and they're judged accordingly. They're equal before divine law and God on the day of judgment. Women are traditionally seen as like housekeepers and they preserve the family, raise children. The men are supposed to protect and provide, but it's not exclusive. The Quran does not forbid women from participating in economic and political lives. And in traditional Islamic societies, when like there's agriculture, they participated equally. So, divorce is actually not forbidden, but it's said to be disliked highly by Muhammad, so it's not really common, I guess. Polygamy is permitted with the consent of all parties and just treatment of the wives. This is kind of weird. The sexual promiscuity, like casual sex, apparently is strictly forbidden and like strongly punishable, but adultery, it's only punishable if there are 4 witnesses to the act itself. Which that's weird. That's weird, man.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about like the history around the area during the time this was written, as well as some like a little bit of a few like contextual things that involve the story around this time. So first is the Abbasid Dynasty was the dynasty when this story was written. It's a lot of Persia as well as Arabian Peninsula. It was actually one of the biggest dynasties in this era, and it's arguably the biggest. They were also, because they were the biggest, they were in constant contact with India as well as China. Therefore, a lot of the cultures kind of intertwined, and so a lot of the stories you'll read in the 1001 Nights are kind of intertwined with those cultures. Another thing about the Abbasid dynasty is they're the second Muslim dynasty, and I'm not going to try to read the guy's name who founded it because it is crazy long and hard, but he's the uncle of Muhammad. So that's their claim to the throne, is they have Muhammad's. Then they overthrew the Umayyad dynasty, and they ruled right after Muhammad died. And at first they actually did not claim the Islam religion. They were actually persecuted it, but eventually in about midway through their reign was very short. It was only 660 to 750 when the Assid took over. And but midway through they accepted Islam as their main religion. And this was actually called, during this Abbasid Empire, they actually, this was called the Golden Age for the Muslim empire at this time. And it was a time of great culture impact, so obviously these are all things why the 1001 Nights and these stories kind of took off, is culturally they were in a golden age. And large portions of the names in the 1001 Nights were actually Arabic, but most of the ideas behind the stories and their where they came from were Indian and Chinese by origin. So there were not one author, there were many authors, and also stories were added throughout centuries. Actually, it's kind of interesting. And the first references were in the 800s, 9th century-ish. And there weren't many. It was kind of in the Syrian areas where it kind of formed in about the 9th century. But it wasn't until 10th, 11th century when a ton of mentions and the stories really started popping up in the empire. But yes, and then the name also changed over time. At first it was just the Knights, because obviously as the story, as if you read it, if you didn't, I'll fill you in, but the Knights, it's a king and a queen, and his queen, but the queen cheats on him, and he gets angry, and he marries a wife every night and kills her the next morning so that he will never be cheated on again. And so one of the queens is actually his vizier, which is, I wrote it down because the vizier is quite important in all the stories we read in the book, but they're like the right-hand man to the king. They were originally the chief minister for the king, but it more evolved into a head advisor role. And so the vizier's daughter marries the king, and every night she tells him a story but doesn't finish it to keep him intrigued for the next day so he doesn't kill her. So it started off as just the Knights for the stories, and then it moved into 1,000 Tales, and then 1001, and this is kind of like 1001 Nights. And this is kind of argued why the 1001 is. Can you go to the next slide? The 1001 could mean many people think it's 1,000. 1,000 stories is a large number, so it's 1,000 plus one, which is just basically an infinite amount of stories. But others believe that there's additions you can get that are literally 1,001 stories. So it's kind of here or there why it's called 1,001 Nights, but it's more just to mean a bunch of stories. Okay, so something I found quite interesting is I looked it up, is there's demons in both the stories that we read in the book, and many, actually almost all the stories in the book, or the 1,001 Nights as a whole, there's demons. And these are called jinn, which you would probably better know as genies. So that's actually what they are. But genies are not like in the movie Aladdin, where he pops out of a jar. Even though in one of these stories, a demon does come out of a jar, but they're very different. Most likely they're probably going to kill you. But they're very interesting because they're actually greater than humans. They were created at the same time. It actually says in the Quran, I have a verse here, that indeed we created man from dried clay of black smooth mud, and we created the jinn before that from the smokeless flame of the fire. So jinn were actually created with the humans. So I'll put it, angels, there are angels, and angels are above jinn, and jinn are above humans. That's kind of how it works. But they marry, they drink, they eat, they have children. They're basically humans, but they do live longer. And they are stronger because they have certain powers, which I'll go into in a second. I have another quote from the back. I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me, Allah. So the jinn are actually like also on earth to worship God as the humans are. They will also be present on the day of judgment for the Muslims, and they will be subject to the final reckoning by God. So they're literally the same as humans, they're just given special powers. And some of these special powers are like, they can be in the form of humans, animals, and it's kind of argued in the Muslim religion, but trees as well, because no offense, no one really knows if they're there because they're taking the form of something else. So it's kind of argued what they can take in form, but humans and animals is a definite one. And basically how God holds them accountable is, since they do have powers over humans, is they're supposed to help humans, and if they use their powers wrongly, then they're punished accordingly. And another really interesting fact is that many Muslims believe that Satan, because they have hell in heaven, that Satan or Lucifer is actually a jinn, not a fallen angel. And the reason behind this is because angels do not have free will. But jinn and humans both have free will. So a jinn has free will, therefore he was the one who went against God. So, and I looked it up just because I thought this might be jinn, demons might be something that had during modern times has kind of gone away. But actually I looked up if modern Muslims believe in jinn, and the stats came up that 77% of Shia Muslims have protective garments. I said yes, they have protective garments in their houses, and 57% of Sunni. So over half of both types of Muslims have protective garments against jinn. So most modern Muslims do believe in jinn. All right, now we go. Okay, so there's a lot of common stories that you guys would probably know in the 1,001 Nights. Most of these stories were, however, added later to the collection around 18th century, so well later. And they were actually all added mostly by a French scholar by the name of Galland. I'll be honest, I don't know his first name. And he was actually the first to also write a European edition of the 1,001 Nights and put it so it was spread around Europe. And his most famous stories that he added are Aladdin, which the Disney movie is based off of, I'll go into in a second, not historically accurate, but obviously. There's The Tale of the Hunchback, The 7 Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. I don't know if you've heard those, you probably haven't, but they're pretty famous. And going into Aladdin, Aladdin was originally Chinese. He wasn't orphan either. He was originally a lazy Chinese boy living with his mother. So very off tale from the Disney movie, and that's always true.
All right, so in the 1001 Nights, it's basically a treasury of tales and storytelling, and it's tied to Islam because it shows a lot of how faith in Islam was understood back in those times, and a lot of the arts and sciences as well. They're covered across a pretty big region, basically current day Afghanistan, and as he mentioned before, the Baghdad, which was the capital city of Abbasid, right? That was the basically the big empire back then, and there's a lot of examples of kismet or destiny that are shown. Cleverness, willingness, and how people cope with fate, like I just said. That's kind of all tied to some Islamic culture. Piety is shown. There's a lot of examples of people being pious in order to sort of deceive others. Women, I saw one of the sources that I was kind of researching, and in the 1001 Nights, they have some differences. They could go about more freely, travel if they wish, own property, businesses, and be kind of like powerful. Arranged marriages, as it's still common, they kind of had neither of the couple seeing each other until after the wedding. Divorcing kind of easily. Polygamy was common. There were marriages, however, arranged because the man did desire the woman. Love matches, and basically not all were arranged marriages. As I mentioned in the first slide, the 1001 Nights kind of contributes Islam's arts and sciences on a vast level. They kind of praise love, compassion, and courage. The teachings of, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Khomeini, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban et al. Were reflected in these stories as well. And it is said that the true voice of Islam is in these 1001 tales. As Jared mentioned, there were demons and spirits called the jinn, and they haunted the deserts. And in one of the stories, in The Merchant and the Genie, the merchant kind of finds himself in a kind of sticky situation. He was in the desert, and he was sort of just throwing kind of stones around, and he hit the genie's invisible son and killed him. And basically the genie said he was going to kill him because he killed his invisible son, even though he didn't mean to. And Gauls, which is another kind of sinister creature similar to the jinn, they roamed the wilderness as well. And they were a little bit more kind of gory type. They wanted human flesh rather than kind of like, I wouldn't say more calm like a genie, but they were, kind of get the point.
All right, guys. Thanks very much. Good job. So I actually kind of want to pick up here with the story specifically that Brett mentioned, because it has a lot to do with much of what is going on in this set of tales generally. Right, so the story of the merchant and the demon. Right, so if we turn to page 566, the first night. Right, this is how Shahrazad begins her tales to the king. It's probably worth mentioning as well, right, that most of the names are of Persian origin. Right? Shahrazad, her husband Shahrayar, and his brother Shah Zaman. Right? You can tell the prefix Shah here. Shah in Persian means king. So in the very names of the characters, right, there is reference to the fact that most of these tales are, if not of Persian origin, are transmitted through Persian into Arabic. So they're borrowed from elsewhere. All right, so page 566, right? It is said, a wise and happy king. All right, going to stroke the king's ego a little bit there before you begin your tale. That once there was a prosperous merchant who had abundant wealth and investments and commitments in every country. He had many women and children, and kept many servants and slaves. One day, having resolved to visit another country, he took provisions, filling his saddlebag with loaves of bread and dates, mounted his horse, and set out on his journey. For many days and nights, he journeyed under God's care until he reached his destination. When he finished his business, he turned back to his home and family. He journeyed there for 3 days, and on the 4th day, chancing to come on an orchard, went in to avoid the heat and shade himself from the sun of the open country. He came to a spring under a walnut tree and, tying his horse, sat by the spring, pulled out from the saddlebag some loaves of bread and a handful of dates, and began to eat, throwing the date pits right and left until he had had enough. Then he got up, performed his ablutions, and performed his prayers. So he sits in the orchard, he eats the dates, he eats his bread, he throws the date pits away, washes himself, prays in the direction of Mecca as he is supposed to, right? He's doing everything he ought to do here, right? He's performing all of these actions in the proper ritual order. And then he goes and leaves, right? But hardly had he finished when he saw an old demon with sword in hand, standing with his feet on the ground and his head in the clouds. The demon approached until he stood before him and screamed, saying, "Get up, so that I may kill you with this sword, just as you have killed my son." When the merchant saw and heard the demon, he was terrified and awe-stricken. He asked, "Master, for what crime do you wish to kill me?" The demon replied, "I wish to kill you because you have killed my son." The merchant asked, "Who has killed your son?" The demon replied, "You have killed my son." The merchant said, "By God, I did not kill your son. When and how could that have been?" The demon said, "Didn't you sit down, take out some dates from your saddlebag, and eat, throwing the pits right and left?" The merchant replied, "Yes, I did." The demon said, "You killed my son, for as you were throwing the stones right and left, my son happened to be walking by and was struck and killed by one of them, and I must now kill you." So, does anything about this situation seem right or fair? Is there any possible way this merchant could have known that the demon's son was walking invisible beside him? So the killing of the demon's son is entirely accidental, right? And so if the kid can be killed with a date pit, I mean, they're not very big or very hard, right? So there's no possible way this merchant could have realized that, maybe throwing away the remains of his lunch a little bit carelessly would have killed the demon's son. So the punishment that the demon levels on the merchant, right, is for a crime the merchant did not mean to commit, committed only by accident. He had no intention of offending this demon. He didn't even know that this demon was there. But because of this accidental transgression, the demon says his life is now forfeit. Now, can we relate this to what's going on in the frame story here? What does the frame story involving these three characters look like?
So this demon guy in the merchant story is getting a little salty over something that was not accidental and is giving a very disproportionate retribution to somebody for a punishment that's a little too severe. And well, the king in this universe's real life, quote unquote, definitely has some issues if he's going to actually kill thousands upon thousands of women because one woman cheated on him. So there's that little theme of disproportionate retribution there.
Yeah, and to be fair to the king, is he going based only on the action of one woman?
No.
Well, he's going based on the actions of his brother's wife, his own wife, his 10 servant girls, and the demon's wife, right? So he is extrapolating from a sample, right? But what I'm going to argue here is that there is, in fact, something that these women have in common that they don't necessarily share with all women. Now let's look at the first seemingly disproportionate killing that we come across in the story. Can I get a volunteer on page 556 to read the paragraph at the bottom of the page from, "For 10 full days he prepared himself."
For 10 full days he
Thank you,
prepared
sir.
himself for the journey. Then he appointed a chamberlain in his place, and left the city to spend the night in his tent near the vizier.
Vizier, yep.
Okay, near the vizier. At midnight, he returned to his palace in the city and bid his wife goodbye. But when he entered the palace, he found his wife lying in the arms of one of the kitchen boys. And when he saw them, the world turned dark before his eyes, and shaking his head, he said to himself, "I am still here, and this is what she has done when I was barely outside the city. How will it be? And what will happen behind my back when I go visit my brother in India? No, women are not to be trusted." He got exceedingly angry, adding, "By God! I am king and sovereign in Samarkand, and yet my wife has betrayed me and inflicted this on me." As his anger boiled, he drew his sword and struck both his wife and the cook. Lovely man. Then he dragged them by the heels and threw them from the top of the palace to the trench below, just to make sure they were dead.
Thank you, Seth. I don't think I can take much more. Okay. All right, well done, well done. Okay, so he catches his wife in the arms of a kitchen boy, kills them both, and hurls them from the top of the tower into a trench, right? For the vultures to pick at them.
Slight overkill.
A little bit, yeah, perhaps, perhaps. But now let's look at the bottom of page 557. Can I get a volunteer to read from after his brother's departure? The paragraph at the bottom of that page. Anybody? We have to spread this around. You don't have to read like Seth does. Anybody? All right, thank you, Kathy.
After his brother's departure, Shahzaman
Yep.
Shahzaman stayed in the palace and from the window overlooked the garden, watched the birds and trees as he thought of his wife and what she had done to him, and sighed in sorrow. While he agonized over his misfortune, gazing at the heavens and turning a distracted eye on the garden, the private gate of his brother's palace opened, and there emerged, strutting like a dark-eyed deer, the lady, his brother's wife, with 20 slave girls, 10 white and 10 black. While Shahzaman looked at them, without being seen, they continued to walk until they stopped below his window. Without looking in his direction, thinking that he had gone to the hunt with his brother, then they sat down, took off their clothes, and suddenly they were 10 slave girls and 10 black slaves dressed in the same clothes as the girls. The 10 black slaves mounted the 10 girls, while the lady called Masood, and a black slave jumped from the tree to the ground, rushed to her and raised her legs, went between her thighs and made love to her. Masood topped the lady, while the 10 slaves topped the 10 girls, and they carried on till noon. When they were done with their business, they got up and washed themselves. Then the 10 slaves put on the same clothes again, mingled with the girls, and once more there appeared to be 20 slave girls.
Okay, we can stop there, right? We get the basic idea, right? So what's the common element here in these infidelities?
Sexual immorality.
Well, I mean, it is adultery, it is infidelity, right? But it's not just the sexual immorality, right? Who are these wives associating with? Right? Who did Shahzaman... What's that?
These girls really like them slaves, I'm telling you.
Yes, they're associating with slaves, right? Shahzaman's wife chooses the kitchen boy. Shahryar's wife chooses slaves as her lovers, right? There is a logic to this we'll talk about in a minute. You remember actually that concept of the Ummah that Lola talked about? What's the Ummah? Does anybody remember? This was like 20 minutes ago, guys.
The totality of the Muslim nation.
Yes, the totality of the Muslim nation, right? And because all members of the Ummah are theoretically equal, a Muslim is not permitted to own another Muslim as a slave. In fact, this actually is something that inspired, at various points in history, a number of insincere conversions. People would convert to Islam so that they could not be held as slaves. Yes?
Would that mean that the slaves that all these wives were hooking up with were not Muslims then? And so they were kind of screwing outside of their faith?
That's part of it, yeah. None of these slaves would be members. They would not of the Ummah, right? They would not be part of the broader Muslim community. So, class is also an issue here, though, right? You have upper class women having relationships with extremely low class men, right? So they keep mentioning black slaves. It's like social class actually has a lot more to do with this than race. Social class is actually the big issue in these particular scenes, right? The fact that they're slaves is what's most important. Now, when Shahryar and his brother meet the demon, right, I think it's also like we'll just go back a minute here. Like, what's Shah Zaman's thought when he first catches his wife with the kitchen boy? Does he think anything like this has ever happened to anyone else? We look on page 557. He says, whenever he found himself alone and thought of his ordeal with his wife, he would sigh deeply, then stifle his grief and say, alas, that this great misfortune should have happened to one in my position. Then he would fret with anxiety, his spirit would sag, and he would say, none has seen what I have seen. So when he first catches his wife, he believes in the complete singularity of his suffering, right? No one else has ever had this happen to them.
Says a lot about him.
Yeah. And his brother, Shahryar, when he tells Shahryar what happened to him, right, explains why he was depressed, Shahryar says to him on page 559, in my opinion, what happened to you has never happened to anyone else. So both of the brothers seem to think that what happened to Shah Zaman was in some way a unique event, right? And one thing that Shahryar's wife's infidelity shows Shah Zaman, right, is that it's not. Yeah, Seth.
To be fair, these are two brothers talking, so this brother could just be stroking the other brother's ego, being like, oh yeah, no, oh yes, no one suffered as much as you poor, precious little baby kind of thing.
Yeah, but do you think anyone really wants to think that they're the only person that's ever suffered in that particular way? But Shahryar is feeling secure in his own power and position when he says that, right? In my opinion, what has happened to you has never happened to anyone else, right? Bullshit, right? It is happening to him right under his very nose every time he leaves the palace. Now, when we compare this to what happens on their journey after they've witnessed the wife's infidelity, what do they meet outside the palace?
A demon?
Yeah, they meet a demon, right? And what's weird about this demon? Yeah, he's got a woman he keeps in a box, right? And the box...
That also says a lot about him.
Yeah, it says more than we might initially realize, right? What is he? Yeah, he keeps a woman in the box. It's got 4 locks. And when he comes out of the water, he opens the locks, lets her out of the box, sleeps with his head in her lap, and then is going to, presumably when he wakes up, put her back in it, right? So what does his wife do while he's asleep? She demands that Shahryar and Shahzaman have sex with her, or she's going to wake up the demon and he's going to kill them, right? So, from these experiences, right, the brothers extrapolate that all women are untrustworthy. I would argue that they are actually learning the wrong lesson from these experiences.
To be fair, this chick is literally being kept in a cage by her husband.
Yes.
I'd be making some demands too.
Yeah, I mean, and how is that any different, right, from the palace in which Shahryar's wife is... Okay, it's different in that it's much smaller and underwater. But the idea here, right, is that all of these, like all three of these men, right, Shahryar, Shahzaman, and the demon, are keeping their wives in various cages. They feel like slaves, so they have relationships with slaves.
Well, the slaves don't keep them in cages, so, you know.
No, no, they do not.
That probably helps things a little bit.
Yeah, the slaves are also in cages, right? Their freedom is also restricted. And so, the lesson is the lesson that the brothers learn from this. Oh, hey, maybe we should be nicer to women and give them more freedom, and maybe then they won't do things behind our back. Yeah, Shahryar decides that what he needs to do is kill every woman that breathes, right? This is the lesson he extrapolates from his experience. Perhaps, yes. We look on page 562, right? Shahryar sat on his throne and ordered his vizier, the father of the two girls, to find him a wife from among the prince's daughters. The vizier found him one, and he slept with her and was done with her. And the next morning he ordered the vizier to put her to death. That very night he took one of his army officer's daughters, slept with her, and the next morning ordered the vizier to put her to death. The vizier, who could not disobey him, put her to death. The third night he took one of the merchant's daughters, slept with her till the morning, then ordered his vizier to put her to death, and the vizier did so. It became King Shahryar's custom to take every night the daughter of a merchant or a commoner, spend the night with her, then have her put to death the next morning. He continued to do this until all the girls perished. Their mothers mourned, and there arose a clamor among the fathers and mothers, who called the plague upon his head, complained to the Creator of the heavens, and called for help on him who hears and answers prayers. So, is he limiting his predatory behavior to the women of his own social class?
No, he's taking the commoner girls too.
Yeah, everybody, right? No woman is safe from Shahryar once he sets his designs on her. Right? He's the king, so if he says he wants to marry a girl, no one can say no to him. But everybody knows that come morning, off with her head, right? So this is very much like the situation with the demon, right? These girls did nothing to offend King Shahryar. It's only their gender that sets him off, right? It's only their gender that upsets him. And so, like the demon, he's killing them for something, he's insisting on killing them, on punishing them for something that they had nothing to do with. Right? It's the arbitrary use of force as punishment. We see a similar situation in the story the vizier tries to tell Shahrazad, right? In order to dissuade her from marrying the king. The story of the merchant and his wife, right? Where he said, the rooster tells the merchant to just go beat his wife with a stick until she stops asking questions. And he says, I'm going to do that to you if you don't keep insisting on this, right? But it doesn't work, right? Government by force doesn't dissuade. Government by force doesn't work. Right? What does work to get the merchant out of his predicament with the demon? What has to happen? Or well, what does happen to get the merchant free of his demon troubles?
3 other people tell them their interesting stories for part of his life.
Yeah, we have these 3 merchants, right? Or the 3 old men. And did you notice a pattern in the stories the old men tell?
It comes from the Bible. Or 2 of them.
What do you mean they come from the Bible?
Well, they have a correlation with the Bible, shall I say.
Okay, what's that correlation?
One of them is like Abraham, and one of them is Samson. Like how Samson gets tricked into telling the girl his secret, and those are always dead.
Kind of. Sort of, yeah, I mean, there is, the first old man's tale, right, does refer to the Abraham and Isaac story, right? In that, he nearly inadvertently sacrifices his son, right? Right, does kill his mistress. But who's responsible for the trouble in the first place? Who's turned the son and the mistress into cows? His wife, yes. And who fixes the problem?
Not a slave girl, shepherd's daughter.
The shepherd's daughter, right? Yeah. The shepherd's daughter fixes the issue. Now, if we look at the second old man's story, who's responsible for his problems? Pardon?
His wife.
In the second old man's story?
His other brother.
His brothers, right, are the ones causing the trouble in that story. His brothers are jealous of his success and of his new young wife. And so who fixes the trouble with the brothers? The wife does, right? She is, she's a demon, she's a jinn, but she's one of the jinn who believes in God, right? Right. So the wife is a jinn, fixes the trouble. Now what about the third old man? His story is briefer than the other 2, but it's also the most similar to Shahryar's direct experience, right? Catches wife in bed with a slave, wife turns him into a dog, butcher's daughter turns him back into a human being, right? So what do we see happening in at least 2 of these stories?
Women of a lower social class solving the problem.
Yeah, in all 3 stories, right, a woman fixes the problem. And in the first and third stories, a good woman fixes a problem that was caused by a bad woman, right? A good woman heals the damage that a bad woman did. And I think it would be also worth looking at some of the characteristics of the old men themselves, right? So let's look at the first old man's tale. Right? Why is he going to kill these cows in the first place? What are they being used for? look on page 571. When I came back after all this was done, and inquired about my mistress and my son, she answered, your mistress died, and your son ran away 2 months ago, and I have had no news from him ever since. When I heard her, I grieved for my mistress. With an anguished heart, I mourned for my son for nearly a year. When the great feast of the Immolation drew near, I summoned the shepherd and ordered him to bring me a fat cow for the sacrifice. So the great feast of the Immolation, our presenters talked about how, like, at the end of the Hajj, right, at the end of the pilgrimage season, there's a great big celebration and feast, right? That's the great feast of the Immolation. So we see that he properly marks religious festivals. And when the cow that is sacrificed turns out to be nothing but skin and bone, what does he do with it? The shepherd butchered her, and when he skinned her, he found neither meat nor fat, but only skin and bone. I regretted having her butchered and said to the shepherd, take her all for yourself, or give her as alms to whomever you wish, and find me a fat young bull from among the flock. Right? So he donates whatever parts of the cow can be used to someone poorer than himself. Right? So there's the giving of alms. And he doesn't kill the bull that comes up and starts nuzzling him, right? He doesn't realize it's his son, but like out of kindness, he decides to spare it. Now, as for the second old man, why does the female genie save him? How is he different from his two brothers?
They keep wasting their money.
Yeah, they keep wasting their money, right? And each time they come to him,
Give them more.
and he helps them, right? Yeah, so he displays the virtue of generosity. Right? In fact, he marries the female demon out of generosity, right? Because she presents herself to him as a poor beggar girl. He marries her out of pity to take care of her, and then she takes care of him, right? So because he displays this generosity, because he embodies that pillar of zakat, almsgiving, it gets him out of trouble, right? So not to belabor this point, but characters who show virtue in the Islamic sense are rewarded. Characters who do not, right? Characters who are wasteful or selfish, characters who are deceitful and plot against others, do not prosper. So there's a definite moral aspect to what's going on in most of these stories. Now, the other thing to note here is it enough for one person, just one person, to redeem the merchant from the demon? It takes three, right? It takes a group of old men who have all suffered similar problems and similar shames to rescue the merchant from his fate at the hands of the demon. So think back to what we said at the beginning about how Shahzaman and Shahryar felt about themselves when they discovered their wives' infidelity, right? This has never happened to anyone before, right? I am alone in my suffering. Never, never, never has anything like this happened to anybody else. Right? This is reinforcing this idea, right, of the Ummah as all important, right? The community of believers as all important. That's what matters here. Everybody working together towards a common goal. Right? Everybody working together to keep each other out of trouble. Right? Selfish people don't prosper. People who go it alone don't prosper. People who work to help others as a group do. And you'll see this sort of this operating pretty much throughout the remainder of the text. All right, so does anybody have any questions about any of what we've read so far? Yeah, Kathy.
And so this is like a Muslim text, right? Obviously. And
Yeah.
So, and they're not supposed to like commit adultery or promiscuity.
Right.
And so, but you know how like in the past we talked about kings who have like mistresses and everything like
Sure.
that? The kings in here, they're definitely not allowed to do that as well because of their religion.
Well, there are a couple of different grades of marriage here. There is like true marriage is only between social equals. So the king's concubines are actually referred to as slave girls because technically that would be their status, right? They're owned by the king, they're possessions of the king, right? And the mistress of the first old man would also be probably more like a concubine, right? So, there is a relationship there, but she would not be of high enough status for him to marry her, right? Now, another thing to note about cultures that are polygamous in this particular, like cultures in which a man can have more than one wife. In most cases, the wife has to agree, right? She cannot simply be married off to someone chosen by her parents. And the man usually has to pay a bride price to demonstrate, like, so, how in a lot of monogamous cultures, women used to have to pay a dowry to a husband? It tends to work the opposite way in polygamous cultures, right? You have to prove that you actually have the means to support the wife you want to take home, you want to bring home. So yeah, so typically only very wealthy men would have had more than one wife.
Because like the king kept getting married and just sleep with her for one night and then kill them. So my question is like, why didn't he just like invite them to the castle without marrying? Because that's like a whole ceremony and everything. Instead he could just sleep with them and then kill them. Instead of going all through the trouble with having her to be his wife.
I think that there are two answers to that. One, it is just a story. And two, also like the element of marriage like sort of adds a kind of ritual humiliation to it, right? I'm not just going to take you, use you for my pleasure, and then kill you. I am going to take you, marry you, make you officially queen for a day, use you for my pleasure, then kill you, right? So yeah, I think there's an attitude, there's a ritual humiliation of the women that's sort of going through this as well. It also, the fact that he's marrying them also shows again Shahryar's kind of infinite resources, right? That this is a guy who's rich enough to just keep marrying women over and over and over and over again. Any other questions?
So with Shahrazad, the girl,
Yes.
is she like? First of all, is she voluntarily going to marry this guy? I've read like different versions where
Sure.
sometimes he's just picking her and then she's going with it, or sometimes she's like volunteering herself as tribute, that sort of thing.
At least in this version, and what we have here is a translation of the earliest complete version of this. So this would be from a 14th century Syrian manuscript. At least in this version, she's not just volunteering, she's insisting. Right? She is demanding that her father take her to the king to be married, right? Because again, like what she is doing, she is trying to do for all women and for the kingdom at large, right? She's not necessarily doing it because she is overwhelmed with great desire for,
this guy who's killed thousands of women.
Yeah, King Shahryar, the murder happy, right? She's doing this, for the greater good, for the good of the Ummah, right? Because one, he's distracted from the business of government by all this marrying and killing. And two, if someone doesn't intervene and do something, there won't be any women left in the kingdom, right? So yeah, what Shahrazad is doing, she does for the good of all. That's sort of part of the point here. And I think, you know, it's sort of interesting that you point to different versions, because there are dozens of different versions of this same tale. Right now, our presenters talked about part of this. I think Jared specifically mentioned a Frenchman by the name of Antoine Galland. And Galland, in the 18th century, produced a French translation of that 14th century Syrian manuscript, the same one that this translation is taken from. But Galland, well, one, was struck by the incredible financial success of his venture, right? People just bought this up like crazy. In fact, the first English translation of the Knights was a pirated edition of Galland. And he took that 1001 number quite literally. And he decided that he must actually have an incomplete manuscript because there were only about 230 some tales. So he needed to somehow find about 770 more. And so he started adding many of these stories that we think of as part of the 1001 Nights that are not, like Aladdin, like the stories of Sinbad the Sailor. Basically, he would find any Arab or Persian visiting Paris, go and interview them, and pick their brain to get all of the stories they knew, right? Now, for a lot of Europeans, this was their first real introduction to anything to do with Arabic culture. And this is only one of a number of different similarly constructed Arabic story collections, right? There's another one called Kalila and Timna. There's one that just went into a new edition called News of the Strange. And they all work more or less the same way, right? There's a frame narrative, and the characters in the frame narrative tell each other stories that reflect the plot of that frame narrative. The 1001 Nights wasn't necessarily the most popular of these in the Arab world, but because of the circumstances of its transmission into Europe, it's become by far the best known of these in the West. And indeed, like a lot of our ideas about what Middle Eastern cultures in particular look like are taken from these early 18th century and 19th century versions of the 1001 Nights. We'll hit on that in a little bit more detail next time. I'm going to throw out a word that I want you guys to maybe look up and think about. That word is Orientalism. All right, so does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, Seth, go ahead.
So I understand that this is a very, 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 very old story. But at the same time, and of course there's a whole cultural thing behind the culture of people who wrote it, but shouldn't the king have this little arc where he's like, wow, I really done messed up in killing all these women? Because like at the end of the whole thing, he's just kind of, and you know, he's fallen head over heels in love with her, and so he's like, okay, I won't kill you, yay, happy ever after. But at the same time,
well, if you look at actually some of those little kind of interstitial pieces in italics, you find that as Shahrazad tells the stories, they do start to have an effect on him, right? You know, he greets the vizier warmly, he attends more diligently to the business of the kingdom, right? So this is actually something we're going to pick up a little bit more next time because those stories are more directly related to this. But he does actually seem to start paying more attention to the business of the kingdom and becoming a better king, as well as a less bloodthirsty and murderous human being. So we do start, and the fact of the matter is too, like, the frame narratives in any of these tale collections are primarily excuses for stringing together a bunch of stories, right? So the stories do relate to the frame narrative, and the frame narrative does relate to some of these important cultural concepts, but what's really most important is the individual stories in the collection.
That's fair.
All right. Anything else? Other questions? Okay, I have some reading questions for you. I have some stuff to give back to you as well. Thank you for not packing up your crap before I told you to. And we'll see you on Wednesday, right? And remember, look up and think about this word, Orientalism.